appears all political sides and commentators are concerned about the men and trying to appeal to them and promise them a dignified living, doesn't it? The decline of men's well-being is a prolific topic of discussion on the web right now. It reinvigorated the manosphere with fresh, nuanced, and lengthy discussions of the state of men and their well-being. I know that we are on the cusp of an election cycle, so this is to be expected. In these times, politicians of all sides claim to solve all the issues under the sun, but in reality they merely want to discover the Overton window of the voters and tailor their strategies accordingly. Fear-mongering is also a favorite tactic of getting elected. The Democrats try to terrify the younger demographic because the younger people tend to be leftists, and the Republicans try to scare the older generations as they tend to be conservative. They do this to increase the voter turnout of the demographics most aligned with them. They also try to demoralize opposition. Every politician deploys psy-ops to demonize opposition to the point their supporters don't turn up to vote. We witnessed this stuff glaringly in the Trump election. Trump was presented as pure menace and chaos, and even the Democrats were backstabbing each other like crazy psychopaths.
Add to that, the strangers with internet connection on YouTube and blogs are trying to amass as much views as possible. They either want to recruit for the party they believe in, or they are following a trend to keep their content fresh and popular.
So there's some truth to this, as we see this trend pop up every 4 years. However, this is not the full truth. The decline in wages, educational attainment, and opportunities for young men are indeed tangible, and the advocacy for men to join health and education sectors may be viewed as necessary for men as menial labor jobs have dwindled or pay vastly lower than they used to. Young men are facing dwindling of prospects on all fronts, in marriage, in dating, in jobs, in education, and so much more, and they are acting accordingly and withdrawing progressively from society that devalues them. They aren't working as much, they aren't having families as much, they aren't dating as much, they aren't buying homes as much. This is what I call the silent win of MGTOW. Surprisingly, when we MGTOW win, nobody notices a thing. We operate in the shadows and we succeed in the shadows. As for me, I like it this way. I don't want to be in the spotlight. Given the latest development, it's almost certain that it be a matter of time before we get pushback. And now we have one. We are certainly living through a silent backlash against MGTOW. Make no mistake about it. The mainstream media and all current famed social commentators are very aware of MGTOW. I've recently seen Richard Reeves say in an interview that MGTOW does not fill him with gladness. Unfortunately, I'm unable to find that interview anymore, as anything related to MGTOW is censored from search engines. These commentators have willingly decided to not discuss MGTOW, to not inadvertently advertise it. But when it comes to this space, they are very much aware of its existence and the key players in it. If you contemplate the current advocacy for men, especially young single men, you sense that something is wildly off. Something is atypically awry. The advocacy sounds specifically constructed to valorize fatherhood and vilify bachelorhood, and this is done by design. The single women are strong, powerful, and successful. Single men, by contrast, are just a failure to launch, lonely, depressed, and dangerous even. The feminists and ostensible MRAs valorize fatherhood through shunning and demeaning bachelors. Their rhetoric is always argued for in relation to being bachelor, and how single men are less happy, have lower lifespans, and commit suicide more. This may be true. But what's at the center of the debate is not what the data says, but how this data is used. Is it used for the improvement of the life of single men or beating them into submitting to a woman? Well, you know the answer. The situation we find ourselves in is simply less of advocating for men and more of indoctrinating them into getting married and serving a woman through the sheeple behavior of mindless self-sacrifice. And unfortunately, it's often advanced in our spaces under the rubric of red pill theory. This is where we have often erred as MGTOW. We often viewed any defense of men as progress, not noticing we are aiding in digging our graves. It's not entirely doom and gloom. We are fairly good at combating being hijacked. Many scholars have admonished us and lamented that even well-meaning good MGTOWs who would never seek to oppress women are still being misogynistic. What these scholars don't see is that misogyny is often used as a litmus test to weed out unauthentic MGTOWs. We have to gatekeep this space to protect ourselves from being hijacked and swayed into our self-destruction. But it remains to be seen that we've been more vulnerable to our friends than to our enemies. The The MRAs and ostensible MRAs are remolding our space into rather mindless gynocentric drivel of pointless self-sacrifice for women. MGTOW as is right now is so intertwined with the interests of family-oriented men to our detriment. We talk about divorce, parental alienation, and lack of adequate prospective female partners, and most of our argumentation is about providing family-oriented men and fathers and male divorcees more power and control over their destiny. And we are so successful at that. Don't let ignorant defeatists gaslight you. Parental alienation was considered a serious condition in early 2000s, and many programs were created to address it in the Bush administration. We also resulted in rise of a feminist movement adjunct to MRM headed by Galloway, Reeves, and others, and they push further for the rights of married men and fathers through generous health plans, paid parental leave, job programs for divorcees who can't pay child support, and so on. This is an obvious success for MGTOW and MRM, but here's where the rubber meets the road. These aims, as noble as they may be, are advanced under an egregious distrust and vilification program of single men, which in turn may lead to undermining MGTOW and break young men's spirits so that they throw their lives away at the first woman who promises to value them. The support of father-centric policies are a self-destructive trend in MGTOW. Let me talk about fatherhood a bit and hash out some things so you don't get the wrong idea about me. Fatherhood is beneficial endeavor for the well-being of society. Fatherlessness is the leading cause of the decline in the well-being of children. The men who are choosing to be fathers are doing a noble thing. So I don't want this to be taken as demeaning fathers or ousting them from MGTOW. They are very much welcome. But I have conditions. I will list all of them near the end of the video. The most important of them is that I don't want the focus to be on family-oriented men anymore. We should argue for support of single men first and foremost. Where the interests of achievement-oriented men and family-oriented men clash, the interests of achievement-oriented MGTOW should take precedence. Let's begin with why there's a push for men to be involved fathers. Every society seeks to socialize its men for the fatherhood role. Still, it's an immense challenge. First of all, men are inclined to get sex with no strings attached. If you allow men to their devices, they will construct a culture of pumping and dumping without any desire to tend for or care for their offspring long-term. Secondly and lastly, children require the parental investment of the father for providing and protecting and nurturing them. This creates a push and pull situation whereby men of their own accord are inclined to eschew fatherhood, yet social well-being and cohesion rests on it. The argument in favor of fatherhood is not about the women. It's first and foremost about the children. The mother's well-being may be less connected to having a husband. They can claim child support and alimony, or get government assistance, or get a job, or even do all at the same time. However, for children, their well-being is very intricately connected to having a father, as fatherlessness is the leading cause of the decline in youth's well-being. It contributes to the most urgent social problems facing them. The systems of the past created authoritative cultural programming to ensure men are exploited for the well-being of children and the mothers. Perhaps you will find it amusing how much was required of men due to these cultural scripts back in 15th century to 18th century. Society back then prescribed that men become the primary caregivers. They bore the responsibility for the well-being of their children, especially older ones. Most child-rearing manuals in 18th century were addressed to fathers, and men got custody of the children in all divorce cases. They educated their children themselves. They worked together with them in the farm. Fathers were the ones who kept in touch with children who moved away, and with the establishment of schools, most teachers were men. And for all their work, men were rewarded with authority over the household and property, and wife and children and anybody else dependent on them. On a related note, I was discussing child custody and divorce with a feminist on Facebook, and she told me that women get custody more often because they tend to be the primary caregivers. Interestingly, this is not the gotcha these feminists think it is. Men, too, got custody of the children in all divorces because they were their primary caregivers in 1400s up to 1800s. They would also have control over the household and all of property because they were the ones who managed it and maintained it. However, in late 1800s, with the rise of industrialization, work and home became further separated, and men had to leave the home to work. This is where the feminization of the household began. Domestic chores and needs became increasingly the domain of women. The fatherhood role continued to be devalued and gutted out of substance, and for the subsequent decades, it would only go further downhill from there. Feminism played a large role back then as it did now. Much of the devaluing of fatherhood can be attributed to feminists. They have launched a shameful vilification program during the temperance movement that portrayed most men as drunkard wife-beaters and child abusers, and now we know that most men drank in moderation and were very involved with and loving of their children. And the devaluation of fatherhood at the hands of feminists would continue throughout the years. In the present, fathers are a mere ATM machine with no deep connection and interaction with their children. They are also stripped of any authority over the household or property or anybody dependent on them, no matter how much they contribute. Men are acting accordingly and leaving fatherhood behind. Half of children born in U.S. do not have a father now, and that reflects on the well-being of the youth. Plenty of young men are complaining of atomization and loneliness on the internet. It has been dubbed a loneliness epidemic. The situation would be far alleviated with more involved fatherhood, but men are not stupid to become fathers. Fatherhood in the current climate is slavery, holding men responsible for success or failure of marriage without authority over the wife and children is basically enslaving men. The MRAs were the first to say no to that. They themselves were married and had to live through the alienation and deprivation. They combated fiercely the devaluing of their lives, and they were especially prolific in this regard. The ideas of misandry and gynocentrism and male disposability come from MRAs in the 80s. This gives you an idea of how influential they were. But for so long, the commentators and feminist activists have ignored the issue as screeches of privileged men and downplayed the benefits of fatherhood, claiming it's only a matter of finances and that single mothers are as good as two-parent households. But given the latest development in the socioeconomic sphere and the rise of manosphere, the feminists can't ignore the issue anymore, as it's proven now that fathers are not simply an appendage to women's life. Fathers are better citizens. They obey law more, they think more reciprocally, and aid others more, and they usually provide a much-needed childcare the working women rely so much on. This is something single mothers rarely have access to. There's also hope among the feminists that fatherhood will cure toxic masculinity and reduce male aggression through remodeling men's manhood towards prosocial purposes. All of this is insinuating immensely the creation of a fake moralism to compel men for pointless self-sacrifice and the shunning and vilification of bachelorhood. That's why we see the preponderance of media and movements coaxing and even pressuring men to become fathers from all sides. This is why fatherhood is not truly contentious. This is bipartisan. We got the real man discourse on the feminist front and the man-up discourse on the right-wing front, and both are in essence the same thing. They both aim to harness the life of men for collective needs and desires of women and children. This is not terrible of its own, and fatherhood can be good. However, and this is where the crux of my arguments begin, you should make a distinction between ideal living conditions and real living conditions. Fatherhood is incredible cure to myriad of social problems facing the youth, and the men choosing being involved fathers are noble and beneficial to our society. But that's the ideal living. What we got in reality is a situation where 60% of fathers fail and become limited in interacting and living with their kids. Added to that, we have potential fathers who do not want the responsibility. So these men are not taking on the responsibility and resulting in welfare-dependent single mothers and producing children with myriad of behavioral problems. When the MRAs argue for fathers and family-oriented men, they are arguing for an ideal world. However, we should go back to reality and notice that working toward their ideal that never came since the 60s, in fact it just kept going downhill from there, is distracting us from working toward the ideal of achievement-oriented living that could prove much more fruitful in bringing us happiness as men. The government is not blind to the issues of fatherhood. The Bill Clinton administration advanced programs that aimed to improve marriages through women and children first policies. The government expenditure on single women has exponentially increased, reaching $167 billion in direct federal assistance in 2001. To reduce the rate of single motherhood and increase marriages, the Bush administration reduced access to welfare and invested hundreds of millions of dollars to promote marriage. This was taken from welfare programs that single men pay into. And even today, they still seek to offer more welfare to the family-oriented men. So we have devoted so much resources and energy in favor of this endeavor, all of which have failed. That's the reality element. At this point, advocating for fathers and family-oriented men detracts from much-needed support and resources for bachelors. We are in a situation where single men are lonelier, depressed more, make less money. suffer from substance abuse more, and plenty of other detrimental things. And these bachelors do not get as much attention and care unless they want to get married. My hope is that father-centric becomes on par with gynocentric, and becomes equally stamped out of our discourse. Father-centrism is in line with what the establishment wants, and it often goes hand in hand with gynocentrism. The Economist will write about incels and not about MGTOW. The Financial Times sympathizes with incels, but no sympathy is mentioned for MGTOW, because they are programming men to be servants for women. The New Men's Advocates will stand for fatherhood, but it's a mere Trojan horse for bringing down MGTOW. For instance, Christine Emba was prolific in charting a supposed map for positive masculinity, and it has been a widely famed column reaching mainstream news outlets. Richard Reeves is famous for advocating for the hiring of men in health, education, and administration sector. And we have lastly Steve Galloway, who wants a marked increase in taxes for investing in wealth-building programs and apprenticeships for men to be economically viable for women. But in reality, Galloway is merely fearing the production of dangerous cohort who constitute existential threat to society. Reeves is not much different. He is also worried that the current social structure is producing men who are prone to violence. Christina Emba too shares in the same fears. This is all done by design to attack bachelors and ultimately MGTOW. Unfortunately, young men come to internalize these messages and begin to look down on themselves as an achievement-oriented bachelor. We have to accord the family-oriented men the level of insidiousness they deserve. Married men produce the most egregiously abhorrent conditions for the youth ever through their behavior and voting patterns. They have a direct connection to the children's well-being. The current generation failure is mostly on the married people, first and foremost. Youth violence, adolescent pregnancy, sexual abuse of children, child poverty, and even domestic violence can mostly be blamed on married people. We are supporting a group of animals who just breed and desert or neglect their kids without thinking about the future. We are producing a dangerous cohort who are simply terrible citizens. Nothing is more dangerous than a man or a woman that breed without foresight, unable to keep their relationship together because they are childish and selfish and immature. We have a dearth of emotionally and intellectually viable men to quit getting married and screwed in divorces, condemning us, single men, indirectly to tending and caring for their children. How did it feel? Harsh, isn't it? Yet we do this to bachelors nonstop. I will end this video with my conditions for new MGTOW identity. 1. No more shaming or insulting or demeaning or denigrating or guilt-tripping achievement-oriented bachelors. 2. The interests of achievement-oriented men should take precedence over family-oriented men. 3. Father-centrism should be treated with derision as much as gynocentrism. That's all I got for today. Thanks for watching.